I'm Maria Dalton, and as my 27th birthday approaches, I find myself reflecting on where life has taken me. It's been 5 years since I married Kevin, and we have a son, Martin, who just turned 4. Martin's laughter and curiosity fill our home with life. He's the center of my world. I never imagined that I would experience such deep love for someone so small, and yet every day with him reminds me how much joy motherhood brings. When Kevin and I first got married, everything seemed like a fairy tale. I had a full-time job that I loved, and Kevin was supportive of my career. I took pride in being able to balance my professional life and my personal one, and Kevin seemed proud of me too, at least in the beginning. Kevin, who's 3 years older than me, pursued me relentlessly when we first met. He was everything I thought I wanted: charming, confident, and so determined to win me over. We fell for each other quickly, and I couldn't imagine a future without him. But things started to change once we were married. At first, it was subtle, almost unnoticeable. Kevin became more particular about how things were done around the house, about where I spent my time, and even about who I spent it with. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just part of adjusting to married life, but over time, his control grew more noticeable. What once felt like a partnership now often feels like I'm being managed, and that realization has been hard to come to terms with. Kevin has a younger sister, Jane, who's 10 years younger than him. She's 20 now, and they've always had a close relationship. Before we were married, I didn't mind her frequent visits. I saw it as normal, just a brother and sister who were close, especially with that large age gap. Thought it was sweet how much Kevin cared for her. Jane would come by often, and they'd laugh and reminisce about their childhood while I'd make us all coffee or prepare snacks. Glad they had such a bond. But after Kevin and I got married, Jane's visits started to feel different. They became more frequent, and she began showing up without notice. At first, I didn't mind. I welcomed her and tried to be a good sister-in-law. But slowly I started noticing that every time she came over, she expected to be catered to. She never offered to help, never brought anything to contribute, not even a small token like a dessert or a drink. It was as though I was supposed to be her hostess by default, just because I had married her brother. Jane's behavior became more entitled over time. She would walk into our house without knocking, plop herself down on the sofa, and expect me to serve her, often without even acknowledging me. She always greeted Kevin with a bright, "Hey, big brother," but when it came to me, I was invisible. I would stand there, waiting for a polite hello, but it never came. Kevin didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he never mentioned it. In fact, he encouraged her behavior. He would say things like, "You know how Jane is," or "She's still young, give her time." But time didn't seem to change anything, and soon, I found myself hosting an uninvited guest in my own home more days than I would have liked. Remember one time when Jane dropped by on a Sunday evening, right as I was preparing dinner. I wasn't expecting her, but as always I quickly adjusted and set an extra place at the table. Kevin didn't say anything about her coming over unannounced. Instead, he seemed to assume I'd just take care of it. I served them dinner while they chatted on the couch, completely oblivious to the fact that I had been preparing everything. They laughed and carried on while I cleaned up, feeling more like the hired help than a wife or sister-in-law. Neither Kevin nor Jane ever acknowledged Martin or me during these visits, as if we were secondary to their bond. As time passed, Jane's visits became more disruptive. One evening, as I was preparing to bathe Martin, Kevin called out from the living room, instructing me to go out and buy a cake for Jane, despite it being late. Jane had apparently mentioned she wanted one, and Kevin immediately expected me to fulfill her wish. I hesitated, but Kevin, clearly irritated, accused me of delaying. Feeling the weight of his expectations, I grabbed my coat, took Martin with me, and reluctantly headed to the bakery. On the way there, Martin and I talked about cakes, his favorite ones with fruits on top, and for a moment I let myself get lost in that conversation, pushing aside Kevin's earlier words. We arrived just before the shop closed, managing to get the cake Jane wanted along with one that Martin had picked out, a fruit-loaded cake he was excited about. I remember feeling a strange sense of calm as Martin and I walked back home together, his small hand in mine, blissfully unaware of the tension waiting for me at home. When we got back, I served the cakes to Kevin and Jane, and then placed Martin's cake in front of him in the dining room. Just as he was about to take his first bite, Jane pointed at the cake and said she wanted it. Before I could say anything, Kevin picked up Martin's plate and handed it to her, ignoring our son's protests. Martin's eyes filled with confusion, and I could feel my heart break for him. Kevin's justification was simple: he had paid for the cake, so he had the right to decide who ate it. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I realized that I had been holding back my emotions for too long, always trying to keep the peace, always trying to make things work. But as I looked at Martin, who had been so excited about his cake, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I was no longer just dealing with my own hurt feelings. I was watching my son be pushed aside, just as I had been. As the months rolled on, I started to realize that the changes I had noticed in Kevin weren't just fleeting frustrations or growing pains of marriage. They were signs of something deeper. The man who had once been so devoted and attentive now seemed distant, even dismissive. Kevin had always had strong opinions, but now those opinions were becoming rules. The partnership I had envisioned for our marriage was slowly slipping away, replaced by a dynamic where Kevin's voice was the only one that seemed to matter. At the heart of this shift was his relationship with his younger sister Jane. 10 years separated them, and I used to admire their closeness. I had thought it was sweet how protective Kevin was of her, how he doted on her like a big brother should. But as time went on, it became clear that his affection for Jane wasn't just brotherly. It bordered on indulgence. He would do anything for her, no matter how unreasonable her requests might be, and the more I observed, the more I realized that Jane knew exactly how to manipulate Kevin to get what she wanted. Before we were married, I didn't think much of Jane's frequent visits. It was nice, in a way, to see them so close. But once I became a permanent part of their world, I began to see the cracks in their relationship. Jane wasn't just visiting to spend time with her brother, she was asserting her dominance in our home. She would show up unannounced at any hour and expect to be welcomed as if it was her right. And Kevin? He never once questioned it. To him, it was perfectly normal for Jane to barge into our lives whenever she pleased. I'll never forget the first time I realized just how deeply Jane's presence was affecting our marriage. It was a Saturday afternoon. I had planned a quiet day for us. Just Kevin, Martin, and me. We were going to take Martin to the park, have a picnic, and maybe catch a movie later. I was excited for some quality family time, something we hadn't had in a while. But just as we were getting ready to leave, the doorbell rang. It was Jane. She stood there with her usual carefree attitude, breezing past me as if I wasn't even there. "Hey, Kev, what's up?" she chirped, dropping her bag on the floor and making herself comfortable on the couch. Kevin's face lit up as soon as he saw her, and suddenly our family plans were forgotten. "Hey, Janie, what are you doing here?" he'd asked, clearly thrilled to see her. "I was bored, thought I'd come hang out," she said, already grabbing the remote and turning on the TV. Kevin didn't even glance in my direction. Whatever we had planned for the day no longer mattered. He sat down beside Jane, laughing at whatever show she had turned on, leaving me standing there with Martin, feeling like an outsider in my own home. I stood there, holding Martin's hand, my excitement for the day slowly draining away. I had to force a smile as I bent down to my son and said, "Looks like we'll stay home today, sweetie." Martin, still too young to understand what was happening, simply nodded and followed me back to his room, unaware that his father had just prioritized Jane over us. As the afternoon dragged on, I found myself in the kitchen, preparing snacks for them while Kevin and Jane lounged in the living room. Their laughter filled the house, but none of it reached me. I felt invisible, reduced to nothing more than someone who prepared food and cleaned up after them. It wasn't just the disruption that bothered me, it was the entitlement. Jane acted as if she had every right to be there, as if my home was hers to invade whenever she pleased. And Kevin? He encouraged it. He never once asked her if she could come another time or if her visit might be interrupting our plans. To him, Jane was the priority, and I was just supposed to fall in line. That night, as we lay in bed, I finally worked up the courage to say something. "Kevin," I started, my voice quieter than I intended, "about today. Just feel like..." Before I could finish, he cut me off. "What about today?" Jane came over. "So what?" "It's just that we had plans and she didn't even call or ask if it was okay to stop by," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Kevin sighed loudly, clearly annoyed. "She's my sister, Maria. She doesn't need to ask to come over. Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" I stared at him, my heart sinking. "I'm not trying to make a big deal, Kevin. I just feel like, sometimes it feels like we're not a priority when she's around." His eyes flashed with frustration. "That's ridiculous. You're being overly sensitive. Jane's family. She's always welcome here, and if that bothers you, maybe you need to figure out why." And with that, the conversation was over. He turned his back to me, leaving me feeling dismissed and alone. I wanted to scream to tell him that it wasn't just about Jane's visits. It was about how I felt every time she was around. But I didn't. I stayed silent, as I had done so many times before. As the weeks passed, Jane's visits became more frequent, and each time she came, I felt the same sinking feeling. It wasn't just the visits that bothered me, it was the fact that I had no say in them. Kevin never asked if it was okay, never considered my feelings. It was as if, in his mind, I was simply supposed to cater to Jane's whims, no questions asked. One evening, Jane arrived just as I was putting Martin to bed. Kevin had promised to help me that night, but as soon as she walked through the door, he forgot all about it. Instead of coming upstairs to help with our son, he sat down with Jane and started watching TV, leaving me to handle bedtime on my own. By the time I came back downstairs, Jane was stretched out on the couch, and Kevin was laughing at something she had said. I walked into the living room, hoping that maybe, this time, he would realize how much it hurt to be ignored like this. But when he looked up at me, all he said was, "Can you grab us some drinks, babe?" I stood there for a moment, staring at him. Part of me wanted to refuse, to tell him to get the drinks himself. But instead, I nodded and headed to the kitchen, feeling the weight of my silence grow heavier with each passing moment. As I poured their drinks, I overheard their conversation. "I don't know why she's always so uptight," Jane was saying. "She's just not fun like she used to be." Kevin chuckled in response. "She's been like that lately. I don't know what her problem is." Their words stung, but what hurt the most was the casual way they talked about me, as if I wasn't even a real person with feelings, as if I was just an inconvenience in their otherwise perfect relationship. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about their words. I had always known that Jane was a source of tension in our marriage, but hearing them talk about me like that, hearing Kevin agree with her, made me realize just how far things had gone. I wasn't just competing with Jane for Kevin's attention, I was competing for my place in my own marriage. I started to wonder if this was my life now, always second to Jane, always expected to serve, to be silent, to disappear into the background while they laughed and bonded. Was this what I had signed up for when I said, "I do"? The dynamic in our household had changed, and I wasn't sure if it could ever go back to the way it was. Kevin wasn't just my husband anymore. He was Jane's protector, her enabler, and in some ways, her servant. And I was left to pick up the pieces, wondering where I fit in this new reality. The feeling of being invisible in my own home became more unbearable with each passing day. I had always been someone who valued harmony, who avoided confrontation whenever possible. I didn't want to stir the pot, to cause unnecessary tension, but it was becoming harder and harder to suppress my emotions. Every time Jane walked through our door unannounced, every time Kevin dropped everything to cater to her whims, a little piece of me chipped away. Yet despite everything, I stayed silent. I told myself I was being too sensitive, that it wasn't worth the fight. After all, what kind of wife complains about her husband's bond with his sister? Deep down, I knew it wasn't just about Jane. It was about how Kevin treated me in the face of her demands. I wasn't his partner anymore. I was just there. One evening after Jane had come over for the third time that week, I found myself in the kitchen again, preparing dinner while Kevin and Jane laughed together in the living room. Martin was playing quietly in his room, oblivious to the tension that was building inside me. I could hear them laughing from across the house, the sound of their voices grating on my nerves. It wasn't the laughter itself that hurt. It was what it represented. Kevin was supposed to be my partner, the person I leaned on, but when Jane was around, it felt like I was the outsider. The one left to pick up the pieces of their relationship. The one responsible for maintaining the household, while they enjoyed themselves. I didn't resent Jane for her closeness to Kevin, but I did resent the way Kevin dismissed my feelings for the sake of his sister. As I stood there stirring the pot of soup, I felt a lump forming in my throat. I could feel the anger rising, but more than that, I could feel the sadness. I had tried so hard to be the perfect wife, to keep everything running smoothly, but no matter how much I gave, it was never enough. Kevin never noticed my efforts, never acknowledged how much I was holding back just to keep the peace. When I finally finished cooking, I called them to the table. Kevin walked into the dining room, still deep in conversation with Jane, not even glancing in my direction as he took his seat. Jane, as usual, made no move to help set the table or serve herself. She just sat there, waiting for me to do it all. "Thanks, babe," Kevin said absent-mindedly as I set the food down in front of them. I forced a smile, not wanting to ruin the moment, even though I felt completely invisible. I sat down with them, but the conversation flowed around me as if I wasn't even there. Kevin and Jane laughed, talked about their day, shared inside jokes, leaving me out of the loop. Every now and then Kevin would glance at me and smile, but it was a distant smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Meanwhile, Martin quietly ate his dinner, too young to fully understand the dynamics at play, but old enough to sense the tension. His bright, innocent eyes looked up at me, as if searching for reassurance, and I forced another smile for his sake. I wanted to scream to tell Kevin how hurt I was, but I swallowed the words before they could escape. After dinner, I cleared the table while Kevin and Jane moved back to the living room, continuing their conversation as if nothing had happened. I cleaned up the mess, washed the dishes, and by the time I was done, the house was quiet. Jane had left and Kevin was watching TV. Martin was already in bed, and I felt the weight of the day pressing down on me. I walked into the living room and sat down beside Kevin, hoping that maybe, just maybe, we could talk. That maybe he would ask me how I was feeling, or at the very least acknowledge the growing distance between us. But instead Kevin glanced at me, then turned his attention back to the TV. "You good?" he asked, his tone casual, as if everything was perfectly fine. I nodded, swallowing back the lump in my throat. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. But I wasn't fine. I wasn't even close to fine. I was angry, frustrated, heartbroken, but I couldn't bring myself to say any of it. I didn't want to be the wife who nagged, who made everything about her. I didn't want to be the one who made waves. I wanted to be the wife who kept things together, who didn't let the small things bother her. But it wasn't just the small things anymore. It was everything. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy heart. I went through my routine, making breakfast, getting Martin ready for the day, tidying up the house, all while Kevin went about his day as if nothing was wrong. He kissed me on the cheek before he left for work, but it felt mechanical, like a routine he had memorized without thought. I stood by the window after he left, watching him drive away, wondering how we had gotten to this point. I had loved Kevin with all my heart when we got married. I had believed that we would always be a team, that we would support each other through everything. but somewhere along the way we had drifted apart, and I didn't know how to find our way back. As I watched the sun rise over the horizon, I thought about all the times I had swallowed my emotions for the sake of keeping the peace, all the times I had stayed silent when I wanted to speak up, all the times I had pretended everything was fine when it wasn't. I thought about Martin, about how he deserved to grow up in a home filled with love and respect. I didn't want him to see me like this, silent, afraid to speak my truth. I wanted to be a role model for him, someone who showed him what it meant to stand up for yourself, to demand respect. But how could I teach him that when I wasn't doing it myself? Later that day, Jane showed up again, unannounced as always. This time, she didn't even bother knocking. She walked right in, calling out for Kevin, even though she knew he wasn't home. I was in the middle of folding laundry, and when she saw me, she gave me a cursory nod before flopping down on the couch. "Where's Kevin?" she asked, flipping through her phone without even looking at me. "He's at work," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I guess I'll just wait here, then," she said, making herself comfortable. I continued folding the laundry, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to control the rising anger. She didn't even ask if it was okay to stay. She just assumed it was fine, like she always did, and I knew that when Kevin got home, he would welcome her with open arms, like nothing was wrong. For the rest of the afternoon, Jane lounged around the house while I continued with my chores. I cleaned the kitchen, vacuumed the living room, did everything I could to stay busy, to avoid the gnawing feeling in my chest. I didn't want to explode in anger, but it was becoming harder and harder to keep it all bottled up. When Kevin finally came home, his face lit up when he saw Jane. "Hey Janie, what's up?" he asked, pulling her into a hug as if he hadn't seen her in months, even though it had only been a few days. "Just hanging out," she replied with a smile, clearly enjoying the attention. Kevin glanced over at me, offering a half-hearted, "Hey," before turning his attention back to Jane. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him how much it hurt to be ignored, how much it hurt to always come second to his sister. But instead, I smiled, nodded, and retreated to the kitchen to start dinner. As I cooked, I could hear them laughing again, talking about things that had nothing to do with me, as if I didn't exist. I chopped vegetables with a little more force than necessary, trying to release the pent-up frustration. I had kept quiet for so long, but I didn't know how much longer I could hold it all in. When dinner was ready, I set the table and called them in. Kevin sat down with Jane, and once again, the conversation flowed between them as if I wasn't there. I sat across from them, feeling like a ghost in my own home. They talked, they laughed, they shared memories and inside jokes, while I picked at my food, feeling more and more invisible. Martin, who had been playing quietly in his room, wandered into the dining room and climbed onto my lap. He looked up at me with his innocent, wide eyes, and for a moment everything else faded away. I hugged him tightly, burying my face in his soft hair, finding comfort in the warmth of his small body. "Are you okay, Mommy?" he asked, his voice soft and concerned. I blinked back tears and forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart. Mommy's okay." But I wasn't, not really. That night, after Jane finally left, I lay in bed beside Kevin, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing. I wanted to talk to him, to tell him how much I was hurting, but I knew it wouldn't matter. He wouldn't understand. He never did. And so I stayed silent. I suppressed my emotions once again, burying them deep inside, hoping that one day, maybe things would change. But deep down, I knew that as long as I kept quiet, nothing ever would. For weeks I had managed to keep my emotions in check. I convinced myself that I could deal with it, that I was strong enough to handle the strain of being invisible in my own home. There comes a point when you simply can't hold back any longer, when the weight of your silence becomes unbearable, and everything you've been holding in threatens to spill out. That breaking point for me came on a night that started like any other. Jane showed up, of course, without calling or texting to see if it was a good time. By then, I had stopped expecting any kind of courtesy from her. She walked in as she always did, with a carefree attitude, dropping her bag on the floor and making herself comfortable on the couch. Kevin didn't even glance at me as he welcomed her with open arms, laughing and joking with her as if she lived here. It was a routine that had become depressingly familiar. I would go about my tasks, cooking, cleaning, looking after Martin, while Kevin and Jane would sit on the sofa, watching TV or catching up on their days. Every word, every laugh they shared felt like another slap in the face. Not because they were close, but because I wasn't part of it. I wasn't part of anything anymore, it seemed. That evening, Martin had asked me if we could bake cookies together. I could see the excitement in his eyes as he looked up at me, hopeful and eager to spend some time together in the kitchen. It was a small thing, but to Martin it was everything. I smiled at him, grateful for his innocence and the joy he brought into my life. At least with him, I still felt seen. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, giving him a warm hug. "Let's get the ingredients ready." While Jane and Kevin were glued to the TV, laughing at some comedy show, Martin and I started measuring out flour, sugar, and butter. We worked side by side, his small hands helping me stir the mixture, and for a moment I let myself get lost in the simple happiness of being with my son. I could almost pretend that everything was normal, that I wasn't living in the shadow of someone else's relationship with my husband. But as Martin and I were placing the cookies on the baking tray, Jane sauntered into the kitchen, a mischievous smile on her face. "Oh, what are you guys making?" "Cookies," she asked, peeking over Martin's shoulder. "I love cookies." I forced a smile, even though the last thing I wanted was to share this moment with her. "Yes, Martin and I are baking some cookies," I said, keeping my voice light. Jane, however, was oblivious to my reluctance. "You know, Kev and I used to bake together when we were kids, right, Kev?" she called out to Kevin, who was still in the living room. Kevin laughed from the other room. "Yeah, I remember that. You were terrible at it though." Jane giggled and turned back to Martin. "I bet I could make even better cookies than you, little guy." Martin looked up at her, wide-eyed and confused. He didn't know how to respond to her teasing, but I could see that his excitement had dimmed just a little. He wanted this moment to be ours, just me and him. But once again, Jane had inserted herself into the picture, and I was left feeling like I couldn't even have this small piece of joy to myself. I bit my tongue, trying to push down the irritation that was bubbling up inside me. "Martin and I are just about finished," I said, my voice a little sharper than I intended. "Why don't you go back to the living room with Kevin?" Jane raised an eyebrow, clearly not picking up on the hint. "Nah, I think I'll stay here and help you guys." I clenched my jaw, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. I could feel the tension building in my chest, but I wasn't ready to let it out. Not yet. We finished baking the cookies, and I tried to keep the mood light for Martin's sake. He had been so excited about baking, and I didn't want Jane's intrusion to spoil it for him. But inside I was boiling. It wasn't just this moment. It was every moment. Every time Jane showed up and took over, every time Kevin dismissed my feelings for hers, every time I swallowed my anger and pretended everything was fine. Later that evening, after we had eaten dinner and cleaned up, Kevin and Jane moved back to the couch, resuming their usual banter, as if the world revolved around them. Martin was playing quietly in his room, and I sat down at the dining table, staring at the empty plates in front of me, the silence in the room pressing down on me. I had reached my limit. I got up, my heart racing, and walked into the living room where Kevin and Jane were still talking. They didn't even notice me standing there at first, too wrapped up in their conversation to care about what was happening around them. "Kevin," I said, my voice shaking slightly. He looked up, surprised. "Yeah." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "We need to talk." He frowned, glancing at Jane as if to gauge her reaction before turning back to me. "Can it wait? We're kind of in the middle of something here. And that was it. That was the moment I snapped. No, I said, my voice rising. It can't wait. The words burst out of me before I could stop them, all the frustration and anger that I had been holding back for so long finally spilling out into the open. I've been quiet for too long, Kevin. I've been trying to keep the peace, to keep things running smoothly in this house, but I can't do it anymore. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. Kevin stared at me, stunned. I could see the confusion in his eyes, as if he genuinely didn't understand what I was talking about. What are you even saying? He asked, sitting up straight. You're overreacting, Maria. I'm not overreacting, I shot back. I'm telling you how I feel. Every time Jane comes over, you act like I don't exist. You drop everything for her, you put her first, and I'm left to pick up the pieces. Jane, who had been watching silently up until this point, finally spoke up. Whoa, Maria, chill out. It's not that serious. Her words felt like a slap in the face. Not that serious. I repeated, my voice trembling. This is my life, Jane. This is my home. And every time you walk through that door, it's like I don't matter. Kevin stood up, his expression hardening. That's not fair, Maria. Jane's my sister. She's family. Of course she's going to come over. It's not about her coming over, Kevin. It's about how you treat me when she does. It's about how you make me feel like I'm nothing. Like I'm just here. The room was heavy with tension, the air thick with the weight of everything I had been holding back. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my palms sweaty as I waited for Kevin's response. But instead of understanding, instead of empathy, he crossed his arms over his chest and glared at me. You know what, Maria? If you're so unhappy, then maybe we should just get a divorce. The word hung in the air between us, sharp and final. Martin, who had been playing in his room, must have heard the raised voices because he suddenly appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear. Mommy, he said softly, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. I turned to him, my heart breaking at the sight of his innocent face. It's okay, sweetheart, I said, kneeling down to his level. Mommy and Daddy are just talking. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. This wasn't just talking. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that I wasn't sure I could come back from. Kevin sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I didn't mean that. I'm just frustrated. But the damage was done. He had said the word, divorce. And now it was out there, looming over us like a dark cloud. Martin, sensing the tension, held my hand tightly. After a moment of silence, he looked up at me with his big innocent eyes and said, Mommy, I love the cookies we made. They're really yummy. I smiled, blinking back tears. I'm glad, sweetheart. I'm really glad. In that moment, I realized that I couldn't hold back anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. I had to stand up for myself, for Martin, for the life that I wanted for us. As Jane and Kevin continued their conversation, I quietly took Martin's hand and led him to the next room. We sat together, sharing a plate of cookies, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, not because the situation was resolved. It was far from it, but because I had finally found my voice. And that was the first step toward taking control of my life again. The following morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of soft sobbing coming from Martin's room. My heart immediately raced as I hurried to see what was wrong. There in the middle of the room sat Martin, his little hands clutching the broken pieces of his beloved piggy bank, a gift from my father that had meant so much to him. The coins and bills he had proudly saved were scattered across the floor, and his innocent face was streaked with tears. Mommy, it's broken, he whimpered, his voice trembling as he tried to hold back more tears. I felt a sharp pang of sorrow deep in my chest. That piggy bank wasn't just a toy. It was something Martin had cherished, a symbol of the small joys of childhood, saving up for something special, watching his little world grow coin by coin. I knelt down beside him, holding his tiny hands, but the sight of the shattered piggy bank made my stomach churn. I already had a sinking feeling about what might have happened. I cradled Martin in my arms, wiping away his tears, and promised him that we would figure it out. But inside, my anger was bubbling up. I suspected Jane's involvement. She had been over the night before, and with how things had been going, I knew she had no boundaries when it came to our home. I confronted Kevin, hoping, naively, that there might be some misunderstanding. But his response was exactly what I feared. Jane needed some money, so she took it, he said casually, without even a hint of guilt or regret. His tone was indifferent, as if taking our son's savings was the most natural thing in the world. I stared at him in disbelief, struggling to process his apathy. She took Martin's money, I repeated, my voice shaky with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Yeah, she'll pay it back, Kevin replied dismissively. It's not like it was a big deal. But it was a big deal. It was more than just the money. It was about the betrayal, the disregard for Martin's feelings, the constant pattern of Jane coming first. I looked at Martin, whom had always been so resilient, and now he sat there with tear-filled eyes, his little body trembling as he clung to me. I couldn't hold back my own tears any longer. I wept with him, feeling every bit of his pain as if it were my own. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about our son. Martin had been caught in the crossfire of this dysfunctional dynamic, and Kevin couldn't even see it. His loyalty to Jane had blinded him to the fact that our child was hurting. As I held Martin close, I knew that something had to change. Kevin's indifference to his own son's heartbreak had gone too far. This was no longer just about me being ignored or feeling sidelined. It was about protecting Martin from the emotional harm that was becoming all too real in our household. I kissed the top of Martin's head, whispering promises of comfort and safety, but inside I was consumed with a deep, painful realization. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't allow Martin to grow up in a home where he was second to his father's sister, where his feelings didn't matter. The weight of that realization settled over me like a heavy cloud, and in that moment I made a silent vow to myself and to my son. Something had to change, and it had to change soon. After the events of the morning, I knew that both Martin and I needed some time to escape the tension of the house. The broken piggy bank and Kevin's indifference weighed heavily on my heart, but I didn't want Martin to carry that burden. I decided that today would be about him, about us. We needed to reconnect, to find joy in the simple moments again, without the shadow of Jane and Kevin hanging over us. Let's take the day off, I said to Martin, gently wiping away the last of his tears. His eyes, still red from crying, lit up with a glimmer of hope. No daycare today, just you and me. Martin's face brightened. Really, Mommy? Just us, I promised with a smile, knowing that this was exactly what we both needed. I called the daycare to let them know Martin wouldn't be coming in, and then made a quick call to my work. I explained I needed the day off for personal reasons, and thankfully, they understood. I couldn't worry about work right now. My priority was Martin, and making him feel safe and happy. We started the day with a trip to the park, something Martin had always loved. As we walked hand in hand, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Air was cool and fresh, and the sight of Martin's excitement as he raced towards the playground brought a warmth to my heart. He giggled as he climbed up the jungle gym and flew down the slide, his laughter filling the space around us. For a few hours, the worries of the morning disappeared, and all that mattered was seeing him smile. We played hide and seek among the trees, and I purposely let him find me every time, just to see the joy on his face. His innocent happiness reminded me that despite everything happening at home, Martin deserved this. He deserved to be carefree, to enjoy his childhood without the weight of our family's struggles pressing down on him. After the park, we stopped at a small cafe nearby for lunch. We shared sandwiches and hot chocolate, and Martin insisted on sitting on my lap, as if he needed the extra comfort today. He looked up at me with his wide, innocent eyes and said, "Mommy, Today's fun. I smiled and hugged him tightly. I'm glad, sweetheart. Mommy loves spending time with you. The warmth between us was healing. For the first time in what felt like ages, I wasn't worrying about Kevin or Jane. It was just me and Martin, and that was enough. I realized how much I had missed these moments of pure connection with my son, untinted by the stress that had invaded our home. After lunch, we headed back home, but instead of the usual chaos, the house felt peaceful. Martin was getting sleepy, so I let him snuggle up in my lap, just like he did when he was younger. I thought about all the times I'd tried to use these moments to get work done. But today I held him close, savoring the calm. He eventually dozed off, his small body warm and safe in my arms, his gentle breathing a soothing rhythm. As I sat there, cradling him, I felt a wave of love and protection wash over me. This was what mattered. No matter how difficult things were with Kevin, no matter how much I struggled to keep everything together, Martin was my anchor. His innocence, his laughter, his love. They gave me the strength to keep going. The peace didn't last long, though. Just as I was starting to relax, the front door creaked open. My heart skipped a beat. Kevin wasn't supposed to be home yet, and I hadn't heard him mention coming back early. It wasn't Kevin. It was Jane. I tensed immediately, trying to remain calm for Martin's sake. She walked in like she owned the place, oblivious to the fact that I had spent the entire morning trying to escape the chaos she seemed to bring with her. She was rummaging around the living room, clearly looking for something. I didn't want to disturb Martin, who was still fast asleep in my arms, so I stayed quiet, watching as Jane moved through the house with the same entitled air she always had. She muttered to herself, annoyed that she couldn't find whatever it was she was searching for. My heart raced, but I knew I couldn't make a scene, not with Martin right there, peacefully resting against me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jane gave up and left. I exhaled, trying to release the tension that had built up in my chest, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. What was she looking for? Why had she come into our house without a word, without knocking, without caring about our space? After she left, I laid Martin down in his bed, pulling the covers over him gently. I watched him for a moment, taking in his peaceful, sleeping face, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He was my whole world, and I would do anything to protect him. That day of bonding reminded me of what really mattered, and I made a promise to myself that no matter what happened with Kevin and Jane, I wouldn't let them ruin this. My bond with Martin, our peace, our happiness. He deserved a childhood full of love and security, and I would do whatever it took to give him that. The peace of the day lingered with me for a while, but it was fragile, easily shattered by the events that followed. After Jane's unannounced visit while Martin napped, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her casual intrusion into our home wasn't just an act of carelessness. It felt calculated, as if she had been searching for something specific, and that was when my suspicions began to grow. It wasn't the first time I had caught Jane behaving strangely, but this time was different. The way she moved through the house, rummaging through drawers and cabinets, muttering under her breath. None of it sat right with me. I had stayed silent to protect Martin's peaceful nap, but I couldn't stop wondering what she had been looking for. It wasn't her home, and yet she acted like she had every right to come and go as she pleased, invading our space without a second thought. Later that evening, as I sat with Martin at the dinner table, I couldn't help but replay the events of the day over and over in my mind. Jane hadn't even asked where Kevin was, nor had she stayed to chat like she normally did. No, this time she was on a mission, frustrated by whatever she hadn't found. My mind raced with possibilities. Was she looking for money again? Something of value she could take? Kevin arrived home that night later than usual, his mood more irritable than I had seen in a while. I debated whether or not to confront him about Jane's visit, but part of me feared his reaction. His defense of Jane had always been unwavering, even when her behavior clearly crossed the line. If I brought it up, would it just lead to another argument, another dismissal of my concerns? Couldn't take it anymore. As we sat on the couch after dinner, I turned to him and cautiously asked, "Kevin, was Jane here earlier today?" His eyes flickered for a moment, but then he shrugged. "Yeah, probably. She comes over sometimes when I'm not around." The nonchalance in his tone irritated me. "She didn't tell you she was coming?" "No, why does it matter?" he replied, sounding slightly defensive. "She's family, Maria. She doesn't need to check in with us." My heart pounded as I tried to steady my voice. "It's just that. She was going through things, Kevin. Drawers, cabinets." She seemed frustrated, like she was looking for something. It didn't seem right. Kevin's expression tightened. "You're being paranoid. Jane's not doing anything wrong. Maybe she was just looking for something she left behind. You know how she is." But I didn't know anymore. The woman who once seemed like a harmless younger sister was now someone I no longer trusted, and Kevin's constant dismissal of my concerns only deepened my suspicions. Something wasn't right. I stood there, watching Kevin as he brushed me off again, and a knot formed in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jane's behavior, combined with Kevin's indifference, was leading up to something bigger, something I hadn't fully pieced together yet, but I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. As Kevin headed to bed that night, I stayed awake, staring out the window, lost in thought. I thought about the broken piggy bank, Jane's frequent visits, the way Kevin constantly defended her no matter what she did. There was something they weren't telling me, something I wasn't supposed to find out. And the more I thought about it, the more determined I became to uncover the truth. That night, as I finally lay in bed, I made a silent vow. I would find out what was really going on between Kevin and Jane. I had been too trusting for too long, too willing to let things slide for the sake of peace. But this time I wasn't going to let it go. I needed answers, and I was going to get them, no matter what it took. The days following Jane's suspicious visit felt heavy, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. My suspicions grew stronger, gnawing at me in the quiet moments when I was alone. Kevin's dismissive attitude only made things worse. He acted as if everything was normal, but I couldn't ignore the warning signs anymore. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and I had been blind to it for too long. It was during one of these restless evenings after Martin had gone to bed that I decided to go through some of the old drawers and files that Kevin rarely touched. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe just something that could explain Jane's behavior, something to justify the pit of anxiety growing in my stomach. As I rifled through papers, I came across an envelope hidden beneath a stack of old documents. My heart raced as I pulled it out and opened it, revealing a set of legal papers. Divorce papers. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. They had already been filled out, waiting for signatures. Kevin had hidden them away, probably thinking I'd never find them. Shock was immediate, but then came the wave of clarity, crashing over me like cold water. All the little things. The distance between Kevin and me, his constant prioritization of Jane, his casual disregard for my feelings, suddenly made sense. He had been planning this for a long time. The indifference, the excuses, the constant defense of Jane, it was all part of a bigger picture I hadn't been able to see until now. Kevin was planning to leave. I sat there for a long time, staring at the divorce papers, my mind racing through all the memories of the past few months. How had I missed the signs? How had I allowed things to get this bad? But the truth was, I had been so focused on keeping the peace, on protecting Martin, that I hadn't been able to see what was happening right in front of me. It was more than just Jane's meddling. Kevin had already checked out of our marriage, and I had been too blind to realize it. He had made his choice, and it wasn't us. It wasn't our family. I felt a surge of anger, mixed with sadness and betrayal. For so long I had been trying to hold everything together. I had swallowed my pride, my frustrations, my pain, all to keep our family intact. And yet Kevin had been planning his escape all along. The reality of it hit me like a ton of bricks. I had been trying to save something that was already broken. But amidst the flood of emotions, there was also a sense of relief. I wasn't crazy. My suspicions weren't unfounded. Kevin had been hiding the truth from me, and now that I knew, I felt an odd sense of power. For the first time in a long while, I saw things clearly. Jane's constant presence, Kevin's increasing distance, the way I had been sidelined in my own home. It wasn't my fault. I had been doing everything I could, but the reality was Kevin had already made up his mind. I had two choices. I could confront him, or I could prepare myself for what was coming. The thought of confronting him made my stomach churn, but the idea of continuing to live in this state of limbo, knowing what I knew now, was unbearable. As I tucked the divorce papers back into the envelope, my mind began to race with plans. I couldn't control Kevin's decisions, but I could control how I responded to them. I had to protect Martin. I had to protect myself. And if Kevin was already preparing for life without me, then I would prepare too. The realization wasn't just that Kevin had been planning to leave. It was that I needed to start planning my own future as well. One without him. I stood up, my resolve hardening with every step. I wasn't the same woman who had been silently enduring the slow unraveling of her marriage. I was ready to take control of my life again, for myself and for Martin. Kevin and Jane had been keeping secrets, but I wasn't going to be blindsided anymore. I had finally opened my eyes. In the days after discovering the divorce papers, a strange sense of detachment settled over me. It was as if I had taken a step outside of my own life, watching from a distance as everything unraveled. Kevin's actions no longer surprised me, nor did Jane's intrusions. Now, armed with the knowledge of those hidden papers, I realized I had to dig deeper. What else had Kevin kept from me? I began to observe more carefully, both Kevin and Jane. There was a pattern to their behavior that I hadn't noticed before, one that pointed to something far more concerning than just Jane's frequent visits. Her constant presence, Kevin's quick dismissals, the whispered conversations I often overheard, they were all clues to something bigger. One evening, while Kevin was out and Jane hadn't yet appeared, I started searching through the house again. This time, I wasn't just looking for signs of Kevin's indifference. I was searching for anything that could help me understand the full picture. What were they hiding from me? It didn't take long for me to find more answers. Tucked away in a box in the back of our closet was a set of old letters and documents. At first glance, it looked like ordinary papers. Bills, statements, but as I sifted through them, I found something that made my heart race. Credit card statements in Jane's name with massive amounts of debt. I stared at the pages in disbelief. Thousands of dollars charged to various stores and even a few casinos. The dates were recent, stretching back over the past few months. Jane had been spending recklessly, and now it made sense why she had been so desperate, why she had been rummaging through our things. She wasn't just visiting, she was looking for money, looking for something to cover her tracks. I felt a chill run down my spine as I pieced it together. Jane wasn't just leaning on Kevin for emotional support. She had been using him financially, and Kevin had been enabling her. No wonder he had been so eager to defend her, to brush off my concerns. He was hiding the fact that his sister was drowning in debt, and worse, he had been trying to cover it up. I realized then why the divorce papers had been hidden. Kevin knew he was in too deep. He likely planned to use our savings to help Jane get out of her mess, and the divorce was his backup plan in case things spiraled beyond his control. If the financial strain became too much, he would cut ties, leave me and Martin behind, leaving us to pick up the pieces of his and Jane's mistakes. The realization hit me hard. Kevin hadn't just drifted away from me emotionally. He had betrayed our family's future. He was ready to sacrifice everything we had built together to bail Jane out of her self-inflicted mess. And all this time, he had been letting me believe that I was the one who was overreacting, that I was the one causing problems by not accepting Jane's presence. I held the papers in my trembling hands, the weight of it all crashing down on me. Kevin had always been reckless with money, but I never thought he would go this far. And Jane? She had always acted so carefree, like nothing could touch her. Now I realized why. She had Kevin wrapped around her finger, using him to escape the consequences of her actions. It wasn't just about the debt, though. It was about trust, about how much Kevin had kept from me, how deep his loyalty to Jane ran, even at the expense of our own family. I couldn't help but wonder if this had been going on for years, if their relationship had always been this way, and I had simply been too blind to see it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I couldn't afford to lose my composure, not now. Martin needed me to be strong. Needed to think clearly, to figure out my next move. Confronting Kevin wouldn't solve anything. He would only deny it. Turn it around on me like he always did. No, I needed a plan. I knew then that I couldn't trust Kevin anymore, not with my future, not with Martin's. I needed to protect what was left of our lives, and that meant securing my own financial stability. I had kept some secrets of my own. My savings, my ties to the company I had helped build before I became a mother. Kevin didn't know the full extent of it, and I intended to keep it that way. My decision was made. I would store my valuables, including my savings and documents, somewhere safe, away from Kevin and Jane. I couldn't risk them getting their hands on anything that belonged to me or Martin. With my father's help, I secured everything in a safe at my parents' house, ensuring that no matter what happened next, I would have something to fall back on. As I stood there packing up the few precious things I had left, I realized that the love I once had for Kevin had faded. What remained was a hollow shell of what our marriage used to be, and I knew that it was time to let go. Jane's constant intrusion, Kevin's betrayal, the hidden secrets, it had all led to this moment. I wasn't the same woman who had silently endured the tension in our home. I wasn't going to let Kevin and Jane ruin what was left of my life. As I placed the final envelope in the safe, I felt the sense of resolve. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was taking control. The hidden secrets between Kevin and Jane had been uncovered, and now it was time to protect what truly mattered. Me and Martin. The days after uncovering Kevin and Jane's hidden secrets were tense, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface of our home. I knew I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, but confronting Kevin wasn't something I could take lightly. I needed to be careful, to ensure that when I confronted him, I would have the upper hand. This wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about protecting Martin's future as well. One evening after Martin had gone to bed and the house had fallen into an unsettling silence, I decided it was time. Kevin came home later than usual, his mood already sour, but I didn't care. I couldn't hold back anymore. I sat at the kitchen table, the divorce papers and Jane's credit card statements spread out in front of me. I had prepared for this moment all day, rehearsing my words, trying to steady my nerves. I knew that once this conversation started, there was no turning back. When Kevin entered the kitchen and saw me sitting there, his eyes immediately landed on the documents. His face hardened, his jaw tightening. "What's this?" he asked, his voice already defensive. I met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "It's time we talk about what you've been hiding, Kevin. About Jane, about the debt, and about these." I pointed to the divorce papers, watching as his face paled slightly. Kevin stood there for a moment, his eyes flickering between me and the papers. I could see the gears turning in his head, trying to figure out how to spin the situation. Finally, he let out a sigh and sat down across from me, crossing his arms defensively. "So you've been snooping through my stuff now. Is that what this is?" I shook my head, keeping my voice steady. "No, Kevin. I found these because you've been hiding things from me, things that I deserve to know. You've been protecting Jane at the expense of our family, and now you're planning to leave us behind." "Why? To clean up her mess?" He looked away, running a hand through his hair. "It's not like that, Maria." "Then explain it to me." I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Explain why you've been hiding divorce papers, why Jane is thousands of dollars in debt, and why you're willing to let her walk all over us, over Martin, without a second thought. For the first time in a long while, Kevin didn't have a quick answer. He sat there, staring at the table, the weight of his actions settling in. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. I didn't want it to come to this. I thought I could handle it. Jane, she's my sister. She got into trouble, and I had to help her. I shook my head, my heart heavy with disbelief. Help her? Kevin, she's destroying everything we've built. You're so focused on saving her that you've forgotten about us. About Martin. You're willing to sacrifice everything for her, even if it means tearing our family apart. His eyes flickered with frustration. She's family, Maria. I can't just abandon her. And what about us? What about your son? Aren't we your family too? My voice cracked as the emotion of the moment overwhelmed me. You've already abandoned us, Kevin. You've been so wrapped up in Jane's problems that you've left us behind without even realizing it. There was a long silence between us, the air thick with unspoken truths. Kevin looked at me, his expression conflicted. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. So what now? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want me to do? I took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment I had been dreading. I want you to choose, Kevin. Either you stand by this family, by me and Martin, or you go. But I won't let Jane continue to manipulate you, to tear us apart. Not anymore. His eyes darkened as he processed my words. You're giving me an ultimatum. Yes, I said firmly, my voice steady. Because I can't keep living like this. I deserve better. Martin deserves better. Kevin stood abruptly, pushing the chair back with a scrape. He looked down at me, his face hard, and for a moment I wondered if he was going to fight for us, if he was going to choose us. But instead, he turned his back. I need time to think, he muttered before walking out of the room, leaving me sitting alone at the table with the divorce papers still spread out in front of me. As I watched him walk away, my heart ached, but it was also filled with clarity. Whether he returned or not, I knew I had done the right thing. I'd confronted the truth, and for the first time, I'd taken control of my own life. Whatever happened next, I would be ready. In the days after Kevin walked out, the house felt emptier than usual, but strangely I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in months. The confrontation had shaken me, but it had also lifted a weight off my chest. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had taken back some control over my life. Kevin had left, but I wasn't left with the familiar dread of uncertainty. Instead, I felt a new sense of strength slowly building within me. Martin, with his sweet innocence, sensed something had changed, but he didn't fully understand what. He clung to me more often, quietly seeking reassurance. I would hold him close, reminding him with every hug that no matter what happened, I was there for him. My love for him was unwavering, and that was enough to keep me going through the quieter, lonelier moments. I spent those days reflecting on everything. I had been through so much, silencing my emotions, prioritizing everyone else, constantly bending so that things wouldn't break. Something had already broken long ago, and it wasn't until now that I realized I didn't need to keep picking up the pieces of a fractured relationship that was beyond repair. With Kevin gone, I found clarity in the quiet moments. I wasn't just a wife or a mother. I was Maria, a woman whom had been strong enough to weather emotional neglect, manipulation, and betrayal, but who was now ready to stand on her own. I hadn't realized it before, but somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that I had a life of my own. A career, a sense of independence, dreams that I had pushed aside because I had convinced myself that being a good wife and mother meant sacrificing those parts of me. I was done sacrificing. Each morning I woke up with a little more resolve. I started working again, taking on more projects for the company I had helped build before stepping back to focus on family. felt empowering to reconnect with that side of myself. The side that was capable, confident, and determined. I didn't need Kevin's approval or Jane's intrusion to dictate what I did with my life anymore. I was free to make decisions that were best for Martin and me. I also took steps to ensure that my finances were secure. I had always been cautious about keeping my savings separate from Kevin's, and now that decision felt like a lifeline. I spoke to my father, who had always been a steady source of wisdom, and he helped me move my assets into a safe account, far from Kevin and Jane's reach. Knowing that I was financially secure gave me the final push I needed to start planning for the future, one without Kevin. Even though Kevin had left, his absence wasn't the loud rupture I had feared. It was quieter, a slow unraveling of the bond we once shared. I realized that I had already been living without him for months, maybe even years. He had emotionally checked out long before I found the divorce papers. His departure wasn't a shock. It was an inevitability that I had been bracing for. And yet I didn't feel abandoned. Instead, I felt a growing sense of strength. For so long, I had suppressed my emotions, convincing myself that keeping the peace meant holding it all together. But finding my voice, finally standing up for myself, had been liberating. I didn't need Kevin's validation anymore, nor did I need to keep bending over backward to accommodate Jane's chaos. I could see now that the love I had once clung to was no longer there, but I wasn't afraid of letting it go. One afternoon, as Martin and I sat on the floor, playing with his toys, he looked up at me with those innocent eyes that always seemed to know when something was on my mind. "Mommy, are you happy?" he asked, his voice soft. I smiled at him, feeling a surge of emotion. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm happy because I have you." Martin grinned, his little face lighting up. "I'm happy too, Mommy." In that moment, I realized that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I had already found my strength. It wasn't just in the decisions I was making or the boundaries I was setting. It was in the love I had for Martin and the love I had rediscovered for myself. That was where my strength came from, and nothing could take that away from me. As the days went by, I stopped worrying about when, or if, Kevin would come back. I had made my peace with it. Whatever happened next, I knew that I was strong enough to handle it. I had found my voice, my strength, and my sense of self again, and I wasn't going to let that go. The decision to move forward with the divorce wasn't an easy one, but it was inevitable. After everything that had happened, there was no turning back. Kevin's emotional distance, Jane's constant intrusions, the hidden secrets, all of it had shown me that the life I thought we were building together was already gone. It was time to accept that. In the days leading up to the legal preparations, I spent a lot of time thinking about how we got here. There had been love between Kevin and me once, a kind of love that made me feel like we could face anything together. Somewhere along the way, that love had faded, replaced by resentment, neglect, and silence. I no longer recognized the man whom had once fought so hard to win my heart, and more painfully, I no longer recognized myself. But this wasn't about mourning the end of a marriage. It was about reclaiming my life. I sat down with my lawyer, a close friend of my father's, to go over the details of the divorce. My mind raced with questions, fears, and what-ifs, but with each passing minute I felt a weight lifting from my chest. I was ready to face this head-on. As we discussed the terms, child custody, financial separation, the house, I realized that I had more control over this situation than I had originally thought. My biggest concern, of course, was Martin. I wanted to protect him from the emotional turmoil of a divorce as much as possible. My lawyer reassured me that the focus would be on creating stability for him, and that gave me some peace of mind. Martin had already been through so much without realizing it. Now it was up to me to ensure that his world remained steady, no matter what happened between Kevin and me. The hardest part was not the legal details. It was accepting the finality of it all. The realization that our family, as I had once imagined it, would never be the same. But in that finality, there was also hope. The hope that Martin and I could build a new life, one that was freed from the chaos, the tension, and the hurt. A life where I could be the mother I wanted to be, and where I could rediscover who I was outside of being Kevin's wife. The day Kevin returned to the house to pick up his things was the first time we had spoken since our confrontation. He was quieter than usual, his eyes avoiding mine as he moved through the house, collecting his belongings. There were no words of anger, no dramatic outbursts, just a quiet resignation that this chapter of our lives was ending. As he packed, I felt an odd sense of closure wash over me. This wasn't the man I had once fallen in love with. But that was okay. People change, lives change, and while I couldn't control the path Kevin had chosen, I could control my own. I could choose to let go of the hurt, the betrayal, and the disappointment. When Kevin finally turned to me, holding the last of his bags, his expression was softer than I had seen in months. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." For a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. The apology felt long overdue, but it was there. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Enough to close this chapter without bitterness. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I replied, my voice steady but gentle. "But I need to focus on Martin now. On what's best for him." Kevin nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I know. You're a good mother, Maria." The words, though simple, meant more to me than I expected. Not because they absolved him of what had happened, but because they reminded me of the one thing that had remained constant through all of this, my love for Martin. And that love was the foundation of my strength. As Kevin walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sadness, yes, but there was also relief. This was the end of a long, painful journey, but it was also the beginning of something new, something that I could shape on my own terms. In the days that followed, I focused on the little things. Reorganizing the house, planning activities for Martin, reconnecting with friends I had lost touch with. I started taking on more work at the company, slowly rebuilding the career I had set aside. Each day felt like a small step forward, a step toward reclaiming my life, my identity, my future. Divorce papers were finalized a few weeks later. I signed them with a steady hand, feeling more certain than I had in a long time. There was no going back now, and I didn't want to. This was my chance to start over, to build a life that was centered on love, not on compromise or sacrifice. As I watched Martin playing in the backyard one afternoon, his laughter filling the air, I realized that we were going to be okay. We had each other, and that was more than enough. The future wasn't something I feared anymore. It was something I looked forward to. I had found my strength, and with it, the power to create a new chapter. One where Martin and I would thrive. One where we would build a life full of love, joy, and peace. And that was enough.